or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hi, this is Jeff Shapiro, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the Wall Street Journal Review issue, the July 18th to the 21st issues on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. How the U.S. won the world over at the World Cup. By the time Spain or Argentina lifts the World Cup trophy on Sunday, the U.S. men's national team will have been out of the tournament for 13 days. In that regard, the 2026 World Cup has been a head-shaking failure, especially to the fans in star-spangled jerseys who hopped on the bandwagon only to be violently thrown off a few days later. The Americans squandered a generous draw, a high-priced coach, and a golden opportunity to capture a new generation by blowing their shot at a first quarterfinal in 24 years. But in every other respect, America's World Cup can only be regarded as a triumph. Much more than an excuse to sneak off to the pub in the middle of the afternoon, the month-long party stretching from Miami to Seattle showcased a side of the U.S. that the rest of the world rarely gets to glimpse. They fell in love with the hash browns at Waffle House. They discovered the brisket sandwich at Buc-ee's. They lamented the lack of public transportation options, then marveled at Waymo. All of it was eye-opening. The scale of our shopping malls, the size of our highways, and the cornucopia that is the Costco frozen food aisle. At a time when the Atlantic has never felt wider and U.S. foreign policy has sometimes put the country at odds with even its oldest allies, the World Cup was a pointed reminder that America still possesses a shine dazzling enough to entrance the rest of the world. On every single thing, the World Cup here has been amazing, said Norway's ponytailed striker Erling Haaland, who became so enamored with the States that he went home with several $750 taxidermied raccoons that he bought in Dallas. I like the Americans, he added later. I think they're kind of hilarious as well. I like the way they are. Such glowing reviews seemed improbable only a few weeks ago. During the run-up to the World Cup, fears over prohibitive ticket prices, chaotic transportation, and restrictive immigration policies suggested that the whole thing might turn into an unmitigated disaster. Concerns grew louder on the eve of the tournament as thousands of tickets for the U.S. national team's opening game remained unsold, and a referee from Somalia was denied entry over betting concerns. It all gave the distinct impression that America didn't really care about how it was perceived by the wider world. Yet fans flocked to the U.S. by the millions anyway, and what they found was an America that looked nothing like the one they'd seen on social media back home. That most of these impressions were formed outside the tournament's 104 matches helps explain why this World Cup hit harder than more traditional strains of soft power. Unlike the brief spectacle of a summer blockbuster or a Super Bowl halftime show, or even the carefully stage-managed hoopla of an Olympic Games, the World Cup was an invitation to hunker down for a 39-day stay in America's guest bedroom. Travelers from abroad had no choice but to experience real life. And as it turns out, it wasn't the state-of-the-art stadiums or the 250th anniversary fireworks or anything else the U.S. proudly set out to project to the rest of the world that captivated visitors. The best advertisement for America was simply America itself. Even before the tournament, a study by the nonprofit U.S. Travel Association found that 91% of visitors were glad they'd made the trip, and nearly two-thirds returned home with a more favorable opinion of America. International travelers, etc., are America's best brand ambassadors. All those videos of Dutch fans turning city blocks into bouncing orange waves or Scotland's tartan army drinking Boston Dry merely hammered the point home. Once the tournament began, America quickly grasped what so many hosts had come to understand before, that the moment the soccer starts, everything else recedes into the background. Between us, we've now been to 9 World Cups, and each time The rhythms are the same. The 2022 tournament in Qatar was preceded by a decade of headlines about human rights abuses, and the 2018 World Cup took place in Vladimir Putin's Russia. Yet the lasting images from both tournaments are of all-time greats such as Kylian Mbappe and Lionel Messi dancing on the field. Back when the U.S. bid to co-host this tournament alongside Mexico and Canada, President Trump was in his first term, and no one could have imagined what the next 8 years would bring. A standoff with Russia, a global pandemic, a war with Iran, or that Trump would be president again when the World Cup finally arrived. By the time the whole thing kicked off, the primary host was actively bombing one of the countries in Group G. Sure enough, though, the longer the show went on, the more all the concerns about the cost, about geopolitics, and the sweltering conditions in Florida in July just melted away. FIFA, soccer's world governing body, grew so confident that this World Cup would be a hit that internally it upped its revenue projections on television rights, ticket sales, and merchandise from $11 billion to $15 billion. Yes, it was expensive, ludicrously expensive, and yes, it was hot, until you entered the multi-billion-dollar air-conditioned cathedrals of the NFL in places like Dallas, Atlanta, and Los Angeles. For the purists, there were soccer-specific venues in Toronto and Mexico City, which wouldn't have looked out of place in Europe. But this wasn't a World Cup for the purists or for anyone convinced that air conditioning gives you colds. This was a planetary event for America to prove that its cultural hegemony could absorb the world's most popular sport. You're speaking about the biggest power in the world, FIFA President Gianni Infantino said the day before the World Cup started. Of course, there are certain things that need to be taken into account. Even so, the experience of visiting fans was different from the xenophobic country that had been led to believe that they were coming to. Here, they found that their game day traditions and rituals weren't merely celebrated. In many cases, fans were treated better than at games in Europe or South America. Back home, soccer fans are often dismissed as violent thugs who require police escorts and can't possibly be allowed to mix. At this World Cup, authorities didn't bother segregating them, including at the potentially fractious semifinal between ancient enemies England and Argentina. The UK Football Policing Unit, which works with local law enforcement, even praised America's handling of England fans, whose history of hooliganism has routinely seen them viewed as troublemakers long after abandoning their fighting ways. It's great to see the fans being policed according to their behavior, not an outdated reputation, said Chief Constable Mark Roberts, head of the UKFPU. In that sense, America earned its stripes as a soccer country, albeit one that still gets plenty of the terminology wrong. Never mind that a Gallup poll before the tournament found that more Americans consider themselves fans of figure skating than professional soccer. Within weeks, the ratings for the World Cup had shattered every record for soccer in this country. The irony of America celebrating its 250th birthday with a gigantic soccer fest wasn't lost on anyone who still considered the game more foreign than a bottle of rosé at lunch. But in many ways, the World Cup did a better job of highlighting what the world loves about America than any military flyover ever could. While the 250th was a fraught celebration for those who see an insular, inward-looking nation sharply divided by politics and culture wars, the World Cup showed that these polarizing politics don't always need to define America. That's not to say politics were completely absent, though Trump kept himself conspicuously absent from the first 103 games of the tournament. He managed to make his presence felt in the unlikely arena of World Cup disciplinary matters. After the round of 32, his personal call to Infantino urging FIFA to review a one-match ban for Team USA top scorer Fuller Balogun after he received the red card came across like ringing customer service. Belgium's outrage ahead of its match against the Americans verged on disbelief. The Federation does not defend itself. It does not defend the national team, Belgium coach Rudy Garcia said at the time. It defends football in general. Team USA's 4-1 defeat soon ended that debate, but even if the country's worst impulses still bubbled up, U.S. midfielder Tyler Adams described a sentiment around his team that might as well have summed up the whole tournament. The support was unbelievable, he said. In this moment, we let them down, but I think altogether people gravitated toward the team because we were relatable. We represented exactly what the U.S. was today. I like the Americans. I think they're kind of hilarious as well. I like the way they are. Erling Haaland, Team Norway striker. Netherlands fan in Kansas City, Missouri last month above at laughed Teams USA Balogun and below Argentina's Lionel Messi. A Saudi transformation. Then came the Iran War. A former ambassador on how the kingdom can protect its multi-billion-dollar societal investment amid conflict in the Middle East by Michael Ratney. In my time as U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, I would often find myself exploring Riyadh, marveling at the stunning changes since I first visited the kingdom in 2011. What was striking was less the physical metamorphosis, though there was plenty of that, high-rises and amusement parks, cinemas and sporting venues, and unfortunately lots more traffic, and much more the sheer optimism and ambition of Saudi society. On that first visit, now 15 years ago, I couldn't have attended a concert by the Backstreet Boys or a Formula One race. I wouldn't have seen modern art exhibition or WWE wrestling or heavyweight boxing. I wouldn't have seen Saudi women working nearly everywhere, and yes, even driving. And I wouldn't have seen many foreign tourists, some of whom may have come to the kingdom half expecting to confirm their worst stereotypes of Saudi Arabia as a land of reactionary clerics, and instead finding a very different country. This cultural transformation did not come about by accident. It was the product of a massive investment, both social and economic, that initially grew alongside a period of relatively calm in the Middle East. Saudi Vision 2030, the Crown Prince's roadmap for development and prosperity, is only a beginning phase of the country's planned evolution. But the Iran war launched in February threatens to upend that, especially as highly flawed peace deals take hold and then collapse. It's not just that Saudi Arabia's reputation as a safe place to visit and do business has taken a hit, or that its oil exports remain threatened by Iran's ability to close the Strait of Hormuz and effectively take the economies of the Gulf and even the world hostage. It's that Saudi Arabia has spent hundreds of billions of dollars on its expansion into green energy, manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and service industries, including tourism and hospitality, in anticipation of a post-fossil fuel world. And the infrastructure on which all of the kingdom's modernization depends, not just for oil and chemical production, but also for water desalination, which the country needs for its survival, sits within Saudi Arabia's eastern province, barely 100 miles from Iran. Much of it is well within the range of even the most rudimentary Iranian rockets and drones. And that means in the immediate term, Riyadh will likely have to divert resources away from its domestic development and into bolstered air defenses, including in counter-drone technology. It will also have to work quickly to reduce its reliance on strategic choke points in the region and its dependence on fossil fuels both for its own use and for export. That will likely include efforts to build alternative transportation networks, including new pipelines and rail routes. The conflict will also likely accelerate Saudi Arabia's push into renewable energy, including nuclear, solar, and wind. And although Saudi Arabia is well known as one of the world's largest oil producers, it's less known that the kingdom is making some of the largest investments globally in renewables, including green hydrogen, that they hope will one day power their own electricity grid and be exported to markets to Europe and Asia. That transition is still a long way off, but war, as unwelcome and unnerving as it is, may actually hasten its arrival. The kingdom will also have to adapt its diplomatic efforts. Despite being deeply frustrated with the U.S., Riyadh can't rupture the relationship with its principal security partner. And it also can't afford not to chart its own way forward with Iran, given America's capricious approach to this conflict. Make no mistake, Saudi leaders have long despised the Iranian regime and regard it as the root of much of the region's grief. In a perfect scenario, most Saudis would love to see the Islamic Republic vanquished and replaced with a government that threatens neither its own citizens nor its neighbors. Excuse me. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio reading service. But Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has long recognized that the priority, transformation of the country, requires a stable region. And that is why he restored diplomatic relations with Iran in 2023. He pursued direct negotiations with the Houthis in Yemen, supported the nation government of Ahmed al-Sharia in Syria, and has been vocally critical of Israeli military operations in Gaza, Lebanon, and elsewhere. And this is why Saudi Arabia never wanted this war. Since the beginning, the kingdom has remained oddly lucky, at least in one narrow sense. The Iranians caused damage to critical energy infrastructure and reduced total exports by about 15%. But Saudi Arabia has been able to maintain most of its pre-war exports through its Red Sea port so far. Oil prices have fluctuated, but as of early July, the budgetary impact appears very limited given the scale of Iranian attacks. Still, the country has also been squeezed by pressures. Riyadh will have to continue to juggle its relationship with the U.S., which initiated the conflict with shifting goals and without assurances to protect the kingdom. It is navigating a tense period in its relationship with the UAE, with which in better times the kingdom could make common cause. And it is contemplating an Iranian regime seemingly determined to maintain a nuclear enrichment program, a network of terrorist proxies, an arsenal of drones and ballistic missiles that have already been directed at Saudi territory, and of course management of the Strait of Hormuz, which Saudi Arabia fears may never again be free of Iranian control. Navigating these currents in an unceasingly volatile region is crucial to reestablishing the country's reputation as a safe and stable place for tourists and investors, and for Saudi Arabia's own citizens. Michael Ratney was the ambassador of Saudi Arabia from 2023 to early 2025. Young conservatives have an unlikely new icon, Richard Nixon. Nixon maxing, swag, and TikTok videos have helped trigger a rethinking of the former president's legacy a half-century after Watergate. This is by Philip Wegman and Vera Bergengruen. The kids are Nixon maxing. More than half a century after Watergate, conservative youth are discovering the aesthetic and adopting the attitude of the late Richard Nixon. It's a vibe. Videos that feature archival footage of the famously square 37th president over rap music from artists such as Drake and Biggie Smalls are going viral on Instagram and YouTube. Influencers sport ball caps, crew necks, and fanny packs, emblazoned with messages such as "Pretty girls for Nixon," and "Nixon now more than ever." Hats stamped with Nixon maxing sold out in hours earlier this year. Nixon hype, edit, was not something I knew I needed, one fan wrote in the comments of an Instagram video. Is Nixon pulling off the greatest posthumous political comeback in history? Someone else wrote. Watergate has long been considered one of the biggest political scandals in American history. After 5 men were arrested breaking in the Democratic National Committee headquarters in 1972, investigators uncovered links to Nixon's re-election campaign and an extensive effort by the White House to cover it up. The scandal led to Nixon's resignation, landed some of his closest advisors in jail, and ushered in a far-reaching legislative crackdown on executive overreach. Now, Nixon is being recast as a forerunner of America First by a new generation of Trump-era conservatives, a combative president loathed by the press and besieged by investigators who was brought down by the same establishment that they believed targeted President Trump. While Trump's admiration for Nixon dates back decades, the former president's downfall is gaining new resonance in his second term as the White House challenges post-Watergate restraints on presidential power. What began as 1970s nostalgia memes and revisionist essays by alternative intellectuals is now being echoed by the nation's most powerful GOP politicians. I think that his historical legacy is enjoying a bit of a renaissance, Vice President J.D. Vance said last month at an event at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California, and I think deservedly so. That renaissance is probably the result of a carefully coordinated public relations campaign to rehabilitate Nixon's legacy. Years before anyone under 30 was Nixon-maxing, the Nixon Foundation was making plans to mark his biggest accomplishments from the Apollo moon landing to reopening China. We have 5.5 years of 50th anniversaries, Jim Byron, the foundation president, said of early planning talks that began in 2018. How do we use those opportunities to tell the story? The Nixon Library houses more than 46 million documents and 3,700 hours of recorded conversations. The Nixon Foundation decided to reintroduce the former president by repackaging the content into bite-sized clips. When they embraced short-form videos on Instagram and TikTok, we really saw it explode, said the 30-year-old Byron, who most recently managed the National Archives for President Trump. The clips attract millions of views on YouTube. In one, Nixon says, "I'm not a crook," as gangster rap blares in the background. One Instagram reel features John Hamm's character on Mad Men, waxing poetically about the Abe Lincoln of California, a self-made man, before concluding, "Kennedy, I see a silver spoon. Nixon, I see myself." The memes serve as a gateway drug to Nixon history, said Matthew Foley, the 29-year-old editor of the conservative Washington Reporter. The Nixon Foundation gifted him a limited-run baseball cap with a Nixon silhouette delivering his famous V sign, he said. It was an ironic and low-risk kind of rebellion that inspired friendly smirks around Washington. Foley said he went back to the foundation later to get more. His friends wanted their own. Nixon's newfound appeal is rooted in the bellicose and populist nostalgia that inspires many on the right. He's a heterodox middle finger to the establishment, said Shashank Tripathi, a popular conservative pundit known online as Comfortably Smug. That's the entry for the young folks. Influential figures on the right have also painted Nixon as an early victim of the deep state. On an April 2024 show that racked up more than 18 million views on YouTube, Tucker Carlson alleged that Watergate had been a deep state coup orchestrated by the CIA and the FBI. Joe Rogan later reported the claims on his popular podcast, arguing that the whole thing was set up by the government. Jeff Shepard, a former Nixon aide who transcribed the White House tapes, recalled being furious with the president at the time. Decades later, Shepard said in an interview that his view began to change as he unearthed original Watergate records. Now, the main architect of modern Watergate revisionism, he discovered internal memos detailing secret meetings between prosecutors and John Sirica, the federal judge who presided over the criminal trials. He also found never-before-seen prosecution memos detailing what he considers changing testimony from White House counsel John Dean. Trump's own fascination with Nixon dates back decades. In 1982, less than 8 years after Nixon resigned, Trump wrote to the former president that he was one of his country's greatest men. In more than a dozen letters between the two, Nixon encouraged Trump's political ambitions as they bonded over common grievances. Dear Donald, I know nothing about the intricacies of your business enterprises, but the massive media attack on you puts me in your corner, Nixon wrote him in 1990. Roger Stone, a Republican operative who has worked for both presidents, and who has a photorealistic image of Nixon tattooed on his back, said that Trump remains curious about his predecessor and is asked why Nixon resigned rather than fight it out. Nixon was in fact brought down by the same deep state institutions that tried to bring down Trump, Stone said. The effort to return Nixon to respectability hit a high watermark with the vice president's recent comments. If Watergate happened tomorrow, it would be like a 12-hour news story, Vance said. The idea that it would have taken down a presidency is crazy. The movement also questions post-Watergate reforms that put in place stronger checks on presidential power. In his second term, Trump has moved to roll many back, challenging limits on presidential spending power, firing inspectors general, and testing protections for career civil servants. The real Nixon is important for the right, said Christopher Rufo, a conservative culture warrior who has advised Trump on dismantling the modern administrative state, is that America has been essentially stuck in the year 1968. The progressive ideas that animated Nixon's enemies now motivate the Trump opposition, Rufo said, setting the stage for what he called a counter-revolution. The first step in that rebellion for the right, he said, was for conservatives to recapture the memory of their own heroes. It's a way for conservatives to regain their self-confidence and to reject delegating their self-perception to the left. The White House welcomes the comparison. President Nixon exposed the treachery of the deep state and fake news media, White House spokesman Kushi Desai said. Decades later, President Trump has consistently and successfully fought against these same entrenched interests for the American people and put our country first every single day. Nick Solheim, who's 29 years old, began to notice an uptick in discussions about Nixon during the Biden administration. I see this argument among young people going through our programs all the time about whether Nixon was all great or all bad, said the CEO of American Movement, a conservative group dedicated to training right-of-center policy staffers. Peyton Michalajek, who's 19, shows off her large collection of Nixon memorabilia to her nearly 500,000 followers on TikTok. Maybe it's just because I'm Gen Z, but there's this certain emotional distance from his presidency, said the rising junior at Johns Hopkins University, who added that she leans liberal and prefers a more complete picture of Nixon that includes the lows of Watergate, but also the highs of his accomplishments, such as changing the voting age and Title IX. At the Nixon Library, Vance compared Nixon's 1972 win to Trump's latest victory, arguing that the coalitions that returned both Trump and Nixon to the White House were broad-based and more durable than the one that made Ronald Reagan president. Reagan could not have won his landslide in 2024, Vance said. The revisionist praise is hardly universal. Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley met Nixon once. When he visited Iowa after he lost his bid for California governor, he takes a dim view of Nixon nostalgia. I think the Republican Party has got enough to deal with already without rehabilitating anybody. Nixon is a heterodox middle finger to the establishment. That's the entry for the young folks. Shane Chakrabarty, popular conservative pundit, was a letter from Nixon to Donald Trump, dated 1990. He apologized for Japan's role in World War II, sex slavery. In 1993, as a high-ranking government official, he acknowledged the imperial government's role in running comfort stations with as many as 200,000 women. Yohei Kono announces the apology from Japan in 1993 by Chris Cornelius and Junko Fukutomi. Lee Young-soo was 16 years old, poor, and living with her family in Korea when she was forced into sex slavery in 1944. Through the end of the war, she endured beatings, venereal disease, and 4 or 5 Japanese soldiers a day. This is a story that I told nobody until just a few years ago, she wrote in a statement before she testified during a U.S. Congressional Committee hearing in 2007, because the shame of my shattered childhood haunted me through the rest of my life. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review and the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Historians estimate there were as many as 200,000 women likely known euphemistically as comfort women who were forced to serve soldiers of the Imperial Japanese military in the 1930s and 40s. Most came from Korea, which was then a Japanese colony. For decades, it wasn't a topic of public discussion in South Korea or Japan. But when women in South Korea started coming forward and telling their stories, and a historian in Japan named Yoshike Yoshimi discovered documents tying the imperial government to the operation of these comfort stations and published his findings in 1992, Japan's government couldn't ignore the issue. After initially denying their existence, the government acknowledged comfort stations existed during the war, but said that they were privately run businesses. Later, it acknowledged its army had been involved in recruiting women and setting up brothels. In 1993, Yohei Kono, the country's chief cabinet secretary, issued a statement on behalf of the government acknowledging comfort stations had been set up actually by the government and women had been coerced and forced against their will. He said the government of Japan was sorry and that it was important to teach what had happened. We shall face squarely the historical facts as described above, instead of evading them, and take them to heart as lessons of history, he said. We hereby reiterate our firm determination never to repeat the same mistake by forever engraving such issues in our memories through the study and teaching of history. Kono died June 8th at the age of 89. What became known as the Kono Statement has remained both the government's official position on the matter and highly contentious. The matter is particularly sensitive to the nation's conservatives, who believe that atrocities committed by imperial forces during the war, from forced labor to mass rape and murder in Nanjing, China, have been exaggerated, and Japan should not continue to apologize for them. Daniel Snyder, a historian who teaches international policy and East Asia studies at Stanford, said the Kono Statement is not only the government's defining statement on the issue of comfort women, but also the clearest expression by the Japanese government of the kind of war crimes that the Japanese military committed during World War II. Yohei Kono was born in Hiratsuka, Japan, on January 15, 1937, to Ichiro and Sumiko Kono. Ichiro Kono was a prominent politician who rose to deputy prime minister. He also owned racehorses. While Yohei was a student at Waseda University, he served tea in his father's office and worked with trainers to pick horses for races. He followed his father both into politics and the track, owning racehorses of his own as an adult. While Yohei was studying at Stanford, his father called him home to meet Takeko Ito, the daughter of a prominent businessman whom he'd arranged for him to marry. And the couple had a son, Taro Kono, also a prominent politician in Japan. Kono hadn't planned on politics. He wanted a career in business and worked for a time in the conglomerate Marubeni. After his father died in 1965, his supporters pressured Yohei to take his seat in the House of Representatives, which he did in 1967. Takeko Kono hadn't planned on being a politician's wife. In his memoir, Yohei Kono wrote that Takeko used to say she was bored and didn't have any fun, to which he would say that they'd have fun when they got older. But she died of cancer at the age of 53. The fact I caused her more hardship than most people as the wife of a politician and that this shortened her life, he wrote, is a source of deep regret that I could never fully come to terms with. Kono ascended in the dominant Liberal Democratic Party, which has been in control almost uninterrupted since it was actually founded in 1955. But he grew restless with the party's old guard. In the wake of a bribery scandal, he left the party in 1976 to form the new Liberal Club. Kono returned to the LDP after about a decade and eventually became president of the party. Throughout his career, Kono was known for his commitment to promoting cooperation between Japan and its neighbors. He was also known as a maverick, as was his father and his son, willing to speak his mind, even if it bucked party orthodoxy. The Kono statement was an example of both. Taro Kono said his father was motivated in large part by a desire to foster relationships with China and South Korea. It was also unpopular with members of his party and has faced calls for revision. The statement has also been criticized by some, including Lee, in her congressional testimony, who don't think the statement actually went far enough. Throughout his life, Kono stuck by the apology. Kono deserves great credit for breaking from the revisionist narrative in Japan and acknowledging certain truths about the comfort women system. Snyder said, "The resistance to taking responsibility for past crimes is deep, however." Old divisions renewed. For decades, the presumption among many world leaders was that an international global order would soon arrive. Today's world is far more polarized. By Brendan Sims. When al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center in the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, Vladimir Putin was new and uncertain in his job as president of Russia. Jiang Zemin, a reformist autocrat with whom the U.S. got along, was the leader of China. Great power conflict was nowhere on the horizon. Had it been, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq wouldn't have unfolded as they did, as the U.S. wouldn't have been able to devote so much of its energy to toppling regimes and establishing democracy in the Middle East. The delusion of linear progress in history ran deep. Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, declared in 2005 that to debate globalization, which he believed transcended the world of nation-states, was like discussing whether autumn should follow summer. Policy elites on both sides of the Atlantic blithely assumed that engagement with the West would lead China to liberalize. As for Russia, even as late as 2014, German Chancellor Angela Merkel dismissed Mr. Putin as someone living in a defunct 19th century world. It turns out there's no liberal direction in history, and we're back to a world that Otto von Bismarck, the 19th century German master strategist, would recognize. The title of Brendan Sims' The Return of the Great Powers says it all. Mr. Sims, who's a historian at the University of Cambridge, is no sentimentalist, and the tone of his book emanates a bracing realism. Soft power be damned, Mr. Sims defines a great power in terms of its geography, its population, number of nuclear weapons, the size of its economy, network of military bases, and resilience in the face of pain. Mr. Sims is a writer of piercing insight and concision. He argues that the U.S. has squandered power in unnecessary middle-sized wars in the Middle East, leading us from the unipolar world that existed shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall to a bipolar one with the rise of China, and eventually to a multipolar world characterized by naked peer competition. Surveying the present geopolitical landscape, Mr. Sims considers the self-restraint of Japan, which chooses to husband rather than unleash its incredible technological and economic resources. He refers to the false dawn of France under President Emmanuel Macron, who, like previous French leaders, has sought a multipolar world to balance against the Anglo-Saxons, even as he has discovered that his magnetic personality isn't sufficient to overcome the limitations of France itself. There is a self-denial of Germany, which, like Japan on account of history, chooses not to pursue great powerness despite its technological and economic strength. So intent has Germany been not to play the great power game, and yet to benefit from it, that it has outsourced its security to the U.S., its economy to China, and until Mr. Putin's invasion of Ukraine, its energy needs to Russia. The Brussels leadership of the European Union sees itself as a norm setter, which is sanctimonious nonsense, unless merged with some form of coercive force. Then there's Russia. Mr. Sims asks, in the face of the Ukraine war, if its power is sustainable. He points out that Russia virtually disintegrated twice in the 20th century, once after the Bolshevik Revolution, and again after the Cold War, only to claw its way back. I believe that Russia, following Mr. Putin, could devolve into a low-calorie version of the former Yugoslavia, but with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the U.S. in 30 minutes. Mr. Sims said the U.S. is both an aggressive great power and an anti-great power, and internationalism and isolationism are baked into the country's geography, a vast continent protected by oceans yet connected to the rest of the world, to the great sea lines of world commerce. The return of the great powers emphasizes the geopolitical and economic centrality of Asia. Taiwan is a power keg akin to a combination of Alsace, Bosnia, and Belgium before World War I. East Asia has replaced the Europe of the early and mid-20th century as the focal point of world conflict. To avoid a war over Taiwan in the South and East China Seas, we need to actually comprehend what happened in Europe a little more than a century ago. On Wested begins the coming storm, power, conflict, and warnings from history, with a poignant and haunting visit to World War I memorials and cemeteries in France. He notes that 40 million casualties, military and civilian, was the price of the 1914-18 conflict. On July 1st, 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, there were 70,000 casualties. And in the face of such an accounting, Mr. Wested asks, is there any more important issue than war and peace? The answer isn't as obvious as it seems. For Americans, West Europeans, and the Chinese, peace and stability are taken for granted. Today, the author writes, less than half of 1% of the world's population experienced great power war. And there's nothing that encourages the drift toward great power war as much as the loss of collective memory. Today's similarities to the world of 1914 are legion. As was the case then, great powers are heavily armed and poised to dominate their neighborhoods. Mr. Wested writes, nationalism, populism, and protectionism are on the rise, while immigration and terrorism remain challenges. Mr. Wested adds that the threat of nuclear destruction would help keep the peace during the Cold War is less of an inhibitor now. In another throwback to 1914, he observes that while America is still the greatest power in absolute terms, its power in relative terms is eroding fast as a combustible multipolar world takes shape. Now as then, we live in a world full of nationalists and communal resentments, though the decision times for today's world leaders are short or pressured as they are by the speed of the news cycle, and the advent of artificial intelligence compresses strategy itself. Mr. Wested, historian at Yale, makes a powerful case for compromise. The media are filled with passion for human rights causes. Holding great powers to account is the intellectual order of the day. This is estimable, but Mr. Wested, with the Battle of the Somme in mind, suggests there is an even higher morality that might require concessions on those very issues to keep the peace. Though Mr. Wested doesn't mention it, one is reminded of a young Henry Kissinger's assessment in A World Restored in 1957 about the post-Napoleonic peace treaties wrought by conservative aristocrats, that the greatest danger in international affairs isn't wickedness, but righteousness, which can often lead to war. Mr. Wested praises Presidents Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan for choosing to engage as détente with the Soviet Union, which, though it offended both human rights activists and hardline foreign policy purists, halted the drift toward great power war, the prospect of which was very real in both the 70s and the 80s. It may be hard to think of Nixon as a moral president or to reduce Reagan to such a simplistic theorem, but Mr. Wested's point is virtually true in the sense that he means it. Given our own tinderbox of the world in the face of the Somme, in the face of millions killed, the highest morality has nothing to do with domestic scandals and everything to do with preventing great power war. You're listening to reading articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Review on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Theodore Roosevelt's Journey, the author of An Unlikely Trust, on episodes in the life of the 26th president. Theodore Roosevelt in the Badlands by Roger L. DiSilvestro, 2011. I would not have been president, Theodore Roosevelt declared, had it not been for my experience in North Dakota. Hunting buffalo in the Badlands in September 1883, he was so captivated by the austere beauty of the place and the rugged life of the cowboy that he bought a cattle ranch in the Dakota Territory before returning to New York City. Then, on February 14, 1884, his wife Alice died from kidney disease following the birth of their daughter. Roosevelt lost his mother to typhoid on the same day. Reeling in grief, he fled to his ranch, where he lived on and off for the next few years. In Theodore Roosevelt in the Badlands, Roger L. DiSilvestro, who has written extensively on wildlife conservation, gives a detailed account of this transformative period, including vignettes of life on the range and exploits such as his involvement in a saloon fight. In the Dakota Territory, the future president regained his physical strength and emotional equilibrium while he deepened his rapport with ordinary Americans. As Roosevelt put it, here the romance of my life began. The Crowded Hour by Clay Reisen, 2019. Though the fighting lasted less than 4 months, April to August 1898, the Spanish-American War left an indelible mark on both the U.S. and on Roosevelt. Victory established the nation as a global military and colonial power. And it also set in motion, Clay Reisen writes, that the wheels of myth-making, idealism, and national self-interest that would guide the country through the 20th century. Mr. Reisen, a journalist who has written several books on American history, balances political and social analysis with gripping accounts of combat and a nuanced portrait of Roosevelt. As colonel of the 1st U.S. Voluntary Cavalry, sometimes called the Rough Riders, the 39-year-old Roosevelt played a significant role in the principal land battle of the war, the capture of San Juan Heights in Cuba. Hailed as a national hero, in November of 1898, he was elected governor of New York, which was a crucial step on his road to the White House. In Cuba, Mr. Reisen argues, Roosevelt also blossomed as a leader and honed his ideas about America, its place in the world, and his philosophy of the strenuous life that governed his approach to the presidency. The Path Between the Seas by David McCulloch, 1977. David McCulloch, a prolific chronicler of the American experience, calls the construction of the Panama Canal one of the supreme human achievements of all time. It transformed world trade and accelerated America's rise as an economic and military superpower. Roosevelt made the construction of the canal, which he considered by far the most important action I took in foreign affairs, a priority in both his terms as president. The Path Between the Seas is epic in its scope, detailing the disastrous French attempt, which began in 1881, the fiery debate in the U.S. Congress, that very nearly resulted in a route through Nicaragua, the purchase by the U.S. in 1904 of the French interest for $40 million, more than $1.5 billion today, Roosevelt's role in abetting Panama's secession from Colombia, and the essential breakthroughs in engineering and tropical medicine that made the canal a reality. When it opened in 1914, McCulloch writes, the waterways was the culmination of a heroic dream of 400 years and more than 20 years of phenomenal effort and sacrifice. 1912 by James Chase, 2004. James Chase presents the presidential election of 1912 as a watershed moment in which 4 politicians fought over the central question of America's exceptional destiny. The campaign was a clash of starkly competing visions for the country's future, as it faced the unprecedented sway that monopolistic corporations wield over the nation's economic and political life. It was also a fierce brawl among the 4 candidates: William Howard Taft, the Republican, Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic nominee, Eugene Debs, who was a socialist, and ex-President Theodore Roosevelt representing the Progressive or Bull Moose Party, which he had founded that summer after storming out of the Republican convention. Leveraging his enormous popularity, Roosevelt conducted a 10,000-mile, coast-to-coast whistle-stop campaign. And while in Milwaukee in October, he was shot in the chest by a would-be assassin, but Roosevelt chose to give a scheduled speech rather than immediately go to the hospital. Chase, who's a historian and writer on American statecraft, argues that in the book 1912, that had the charismatic Roosevelt received the Republican nomination, he almost surely would have won. By splitting the Republicans, Roosevelt all but ensured the election of Wilson, who as president initiated large-scale governmental and business reforms. The River of Doubt by Candace Millard in 2005. On his final great adventure, Roosevelt once again left the political world behind. After his electoral defeat in 1912, Candace Millard writes in The River of Doubt, Roosevelt sought to purge his disappointment by throwing himself headlong against the cruelest trials that nature could offer him. So beginning in December 1913, at the age of 55, he co-led an expedition to chart a tributary of the Amazon that is today known as the Rio Roosevelt. Miss Millard, a writer of narrative histories, including 2011's Destiny of the Republic, about the assassination of James A. Garfield, vividly evokes the Brazilian rainforest and its dangers. Over 4 punishing months, the expedition mapped the river's course, facing treacherous rapids, tropical diseases, and 3 fatalities, including a murder in the party. And when Roosevelt grew delirious from malaria and a leg infection and demanded to be left behind, his comrades conveyed him to safety. Weeks later, arriving in New York, he still showed the effects of his ordeal. As he limped down the companionway, the New York Sun reported, the impression was strong that the colonel had endured the greatest hardships of his life. No life can be pleasanter than life during the months of fall on a ranch in the northern cattle country. That was a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. Emmy Rossum has a long goodbye routine with kids. The actress says getting in shape to play an FBI agent in her new show, Furious, was a full-time job. Emmy Rossum had a strategy for shedding her latest character after a day of work, hard pretzels. Something about the crunching in my jaw settled my nervous system and made me feel like I was in my home, in my sweats, in my kitchen, she said. Rossum, who's 39, is best known for playing the scrappy Fiona Gallagher on Showtime's Shameless. But in Hulu's Furious, her latest television series, she transformed herself into Alice Black, a hardened FBI agent tracking down a slippery female serial killer. Rossum also serves as executive producer on the show, premiering July 27th. Alongside creator Elizabeth Merriweather, Rossum developed the scripts for 2 years, researching and meeting with female law enforcement officers. When not taking on Alice's trauma and exhaustion, Rossum lives in Manhattan with her husband, the writer-director Sam Esmail, and their 2 children, ages 3 and 5. Here she discusses her ideal morning, routine with sunrise walks, a specific bench in Central Park, and elaborate handshakes with her friends. What time do you wake up on Mondays, and what's the first thing you do? Well, sometime between 5 and 6:15 a.m. Naturally, I like the dark, sacred hours of the morning before my kids get up. I meditate or kind of just sit quietly in the dark and just give myself a moment to start the day. I have tea. I don't drink coffee immediately. Do you eventually add coffee? Well, probably. Sometimes decaf or regular, but that's probably not until 10. If my husband is home, I'll go and put my running shoes on, and I will usually meet a friend at the Central Park Reservoir and walk the reservoir as the sun is coming up. Then I get home and I make breakfast. It's usually eggs, either scrambled eggs or poached eggs. My daughter really likes to make eggs, and my son really likes to make muffins from scratch. If my husband is not home, then I won't obviously go to the reservoir. I use that quiet time in the morning to read or write or do crossword puzzles on my phone. You have very curly hair. What's the most important part of your getting ready routine? I shower after breakfast. I wash my hair maybe twice a week, but I condition every day and I use my after shower cream and then I usually diffuse. In the summer, sometimes I'll walk out without it diffused, but in the winter, I can't walk out with a wet head. I've really embraced my natural texture since my daughter has been born. It felt more and more important to really just lean into authenticity and to embrace my uniqueness. Outside of the reservoir walks, the exercise, after we all get ready, I take the kids on the New York City bus to their preschool, and we have a long goodbye routine, which involves about 25 different secret handshakes and poses. I'm very embarrassed doing this routine, but it eases the transition for both of them. Then I usually go to my office. My husband and I got an apartment about a block away from our apartment that we share as an office, and it's also my workout space. I have a bunch of free weights, and I do Pilates there as well. Your new show, Furious, which you also produce, is a loose adaptation of the 1987 movie Black Widow. How did you settle on that material? Well, I tasked myself and my company with spending a summer looking at old log lines and titles, isolating the log lines that appeared of interest to us, and watching all the films in one summer to find IP. A lot of people were chasing hot books, which are hugely competitive. We have to be scrappy and we have to look in other places. Black Widow was one that kind of immediately popped out. I'd never seen the movie, and I was so taken by the skeleton of it. The idea of this woman in this very male-dominated world who is so underestimated, who displays very risky behavior because she has to work outside the lines because she's being so underestimated. Do you have any pet peeves? People not cleaning up after the dog. That makes me crazy. That to me is inexcusable. You can get a napkin. You can figure it out. I've had to get crafty when I go to the bag and it's out. Come back for it. I don't care if you got to walk a block away. No one else should be picking up your dog's poop. This interview has been edited and condensed for clarity, Max/GC Images. You've been listening to reading of articles and features. From the Wall Street Journal Review, the week of July 18th to the 21st, we read from the Wall Street Journal Review every Thursday at 7 p.m. Your reader has been Jeff Shapiro. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have the New York Times. Following that at 9 o'clock is Harper's Magazine at 10 o'clock with episode number 8 of Hope Rises by David Baldacci. Stay with us. If you or people you know shop at any of the Dash's supermarkets, please save Dash's register tapes for radio reading. Our agency receives $2 for every $100 in Dash's register tapes. Radio reading has raised thousands of dollars so far. Anyone can drop off their Dash's tapes to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service at 1199 Harlem Road, Cheektowaga, between William and Clinton Streets. Or Dash's tapes can be mailed to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service at 1199 Harlem Road, Cheektowaga, New York, 14227. Any questions on Dash's tapes for radio reading? Call us at 716-821-5555, and thanks for caring. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability.